The horizon did not bleed today. It was sutured. The sunset over the skyline used to be a predictable wash of gold and violet, but this evening, the sky is partitioned by a tangled web of glistening, metallic crimson. Julian Crow stood on his balcony, his hand hovering near a stray strand drifting in the wind. He thought it was merely a trick of the fading light, a stray fiber from a distant construction site, until the thread sliced through his leather glove with the surgical precision of a diamond-tipped wire. A single drop of blood welled at his fingertip, and the strand didn't just hang there, it vibrated. It seemed to lean toward the warmth of his skin, hungry and expectant, a sentient needle seeking a vein. This was not dust, and it was not a natural phenomenon. The city had been rewritten by a silent architect, one that viewed human biological essence not as life, but as raw material. Above the rooftops, the sky was being claimed by a geometric nightmare of scarlet lattice, and the low humming sound vibrating through the floorboards was not the city's electricity, but the rhythmic pulse of 1,000 starving appetites. Inside the apartment, the air felt thick and metallic, tasting of pennies and ozone. Julian's wife, Sarah, was staring at the television, but there was nothing but static, a gray, buzzing void that seemed to mimic the chaos outside. They had watched the first reports of the infestation with a sense of detached curiosity, believing it to be a localized outbreak or some strange atmospheric event that the authorities would eventually name and contain. But then the subway lines went silent. Then the bridges were draped in those shimmering ruby shrouds. The creatures responsible for this transformation did not arrive from the stars, nor did they emerge from a secret lab. They had evolved in the deep shadows of human expansion, thriving in the subterranean heat of the subways and the damp, nutrient-rich moisture of the sewers. Known in hushed, terrified whispers as the blood weavers, these arachnids had bypassed the traditional limits of biology. They no longer relied on the protein of insects. Instead, they had developed a specialized digestive system that allowed them to process the iron and hemoglobin of larger prey into a structural polymer. The carmine filaments were a terrifying evolution of chemistry, a biometallic alloy as flexible as nylon, but possessing the tensile strength of high-grade steel. When it first emerged from the artisan, the substance was a liquid, vibrant garnet. But as it oxidized in the open air, it hardened into a rigid, permanent cage. Julian watched from his window as a stray dog wandered into a patch of the mesh. There was no struggle, only a sudden, sharp jerk. And then, the animal was suspended 3 feet off the ground, its movements stilled by a dozen microscopic anchors. The biology of a bloodweaver was a masterpiece of predatory efficiency. Their 8 eyes did not see the world in shapes, but in thermal signatures and the rhythmic, inviting pulse of veins beneath skin. They were patient, moving with a fluid, haunting grace that defied their size. A single hunter could grow to the dimensions of a hunting hound, its exoskeleton darkened to a matte charcoal that seemed to absorb all surrounding light, making them nearly invisible against the urban concrete. Their legs were tipped with hooked serrations designed to grip any surface, from vertical glass to the smooth, cold marble of a bank lobby. They did not bite to kill, they bit to subdue. Their venom was a neuroparalytic cocktail that effectively disconnected the brain from the muscular system. Julian had seen a neighbor, Marcus, caught in the hallway 2 days ago. Marcus hadn't screamed. He had simply slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and alert, while his limbs became heavy, unresponsive stones. The predator had moved over him with the sound of dry leaves skittering on pavement, its weight causing the ceiling tiles to groan and snap. Within minutes, Marcus was gone, dragged into the dark recesses of the ventilation shaft, leaving behind only a faint scent of copper and the hollow echo of his own heartbeat. As the architects claimed the city, the urban environment transformed into a vertical slaughterhouse. The spaces between skyscrapers were now spanned by massive suspension bridge-like networks that could catch a small aircraft. But these structures were not designed for birds or machines. They were designed to support the weight of the harvest. If you looked up from the street level, you could see them. Thousands of dark, oblong shapes suspended hundreds of feet in the air, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the evening sky. Each one was a masterpiece of structural engineering, a pressurized chamber of hardened garnet strands. Inside, the environment was temperature-controlled by the weaver's own breath, keeping the occupant in a state of suspended animation while the slow, methodical extraction began. It was a city of hanging tombs, each one glowing with a faint, internal luminescence that pulsed in time with a dying world. The process of the weave was a sensory nightmare. It often started with a single, almost invisible thread across a doorway, then another across a window. By the time an occupant realized they were being targeted, their room was already a lattice of vermilion wire. Julian and Sarah moved through their apartment in a state of perpetual crouch, terrified of touching the walls. They spoke in whispers, fearing that the vibration of their voices would travel through the floorboards to the sensitive sensors of the creatures below. The predator enters not with a roar, but with a calculated silence. It moves across the ceiling, testing the vibrations of your heartbeat with the delicacy of a pianist. When it strikes, it is a blur of motion. The scarlet filaments are applied in rapid, overlapping layers, wrapping around the torso and limbs with the agonizing tightness of a tourniquet. Within minutes, the human form is obscured, replaced by a smooth, pulsating chrysalis that glows with a faint, ghostly light. The true horror of these entities lay in the preservation of consciousness. Unlike traditional predators that consume their prey instantly, these creatures required the blood to remain fresh and circulating to maintain the integrity of their construction. The cocoon acted as a biological interface. Microfilaments of the weave penetrated the skin, tapping into the major arteries with the delicacy of a surgical needle. These filaments did not just drain, they filtered. They removed the iron and the specific nutrients required for the ongoing projects, while pumping back a chemical slurry that prevented the heart from stopping and the blood from clotting. The victim was no longer a person with a history and a name. They had become a living battery, a biological reservoir for a city made of red wire. Sarah had stopped crying hours ago. Her eyes were fixed on the door, watching for the first shimmering strand to appear in the gap of the frame. The relationship between Julian and Sarah had become a fragile, silent dance of mutual observation. There was no space for comfort, no room for the warmth of a long embrace. To touch too firmly was to risk a sound, and to sound was to invite the end. Julian looked at her, seeing the way her collarbones protruded, a testament to the days of starvation they had endured while hiding in the center of their living room. He wanted to tell her he loved her, to promise that the dawn would bring something other than more shadows, but the words felt like jagged glass in his throat. Every time their eyes met, there was a shared recognition of the inevitable. They were not just husband and wife anymore. They were two distinct sources of heat, two rhythmic hearts, each waiting for their own unique frequency to be harvested. The intimacy of their marriage had been replaced by the cold, clinical intimacy of the prey. As the days passed into weeks, the silence in the city became absolute. The roar of traffic and the mindless chatter of crowds had been replaced by the rhythmic, collective throb of the cocoons, a sound like a distant, subterranean drum. The atmosphere itself felt different, thick, metallic, and heavy with the scent of stagnant blood and old iron. The hunters moved through the streets with the confidence of apex predators who had already won the war of architecture. They were often seen tending to their gardens, the term survivors used to describe the clusters of cocoons hanging from the bridges like overripe fruit. They moved from one to another, vibrating their legs against the sanguine strands to check the ripeness of the harvest. If a cocoon went dark, indicating the occupant had finally expired, they simply cut it loose, letting it shatter on the pavement below like a piece of discarded, frozen glass. The psychological toll on the survivors, those hiding in basements and airtight bunkers, was a slow, agonizing erosion of the soul. There was no fighting an enemy that used your own biology against you. Every scratch, every paper cut, every drop of spilled blood was a beacon for the architects. They could smell the iron from miles away, sensing the chemical signature of fear through the vibrations of the air. People learned to move in total silence, wrapping their feet in thick rags and breathing through homemade filters to mask their body heat. But the entities were evolving further. They had begun to mimic the sounds of the city to lure the desperate out into the open. They could vibrate their mesh to create the sound of a distant ambulance siren, the muffled cry of a child, or even a familiar voice calling for help from the next room. It was a siren song made of vibration and malice, a psychological trap designed to exploit the last remnants of human empathy. Julian remembered the sound that nearly broke them. It had happened the previous night, a voice that sounded exactly like Sarah's mother, calling her name from the hallway. Sarah had lunged toward the door, her hand halfway to the handle before Julian had tackled her, pinning her to the floor in a desperate, silent struggle. They lay there for hours, the phantom voice pleading for entry, while a dark shadow outside the door shifted its weight, clicking softly against the wood. It was in that moment Julian realized the predators weren't just eating them. They were studying the architecture of their grief. They were learning what made a human heart race, what made a hand tremble, and what made a mind break. The web was not just physical, it was a psychological net, tightening with every memory they dared to hold on to. The environment of the city had been reclaimed by a new, parasitic kind of nature. The parks were no longer green. The trees were draped in scarlet veils that had long since suffocated the leaves. The water in the city fountains had turned a murky rust color as the runoff from the networks seeped into the drainage systems. The architecture of humanity was being buried under the architecture of the arachnid. Iconic buildings like the Empire State were now nothing more than the central pillars for a massive citywide network that reached toward the clouds, anchoring the weight of 1 million captive souls. In the higher altitudes, where the air was thin and cold, the weavers were building something even larger. Central hubs where the most potent iron-rich silk was stored, glowing like artificial, pulsating suns in the midnight sky. Inside the cocoons, time ceased to exist. The mind, trapped in a paralyzed body, began to fracture and dissolve. Without external stimuli, the consciousness turned inward, replaying memories until they became distorted, alien, and unrecognizable. Some survivors who were rescued in the very early days of the infestation spoke of a collective hum, a terrifying feeling that their thoughts were being shared through the scarlet network. They claimed the architects weren't just harvesting blood, but were mapping the human nervous system, learning the structures of our fear and the pathways of our logic. They described a sensation of being unraveled, as if their very identity was being spun into the red threads that held them aloft, turning their memories into the mortar for a new world. Julian felt the hum now, a vibration in his teeth that seemed to sync with the flickering of the hallway light. The entities demonstrated a level of social organization that mocked human society. They were not solitary hunters, they were a synchronized workforce. They worked in coordinated teams to bring down larger structures, weaving massive catch nets across entire city blocks to trap escaping vehicles. Their communication was a complex language of vibrations sent through the web, a literal internet of biometallic strands that allowed them to coordinate their movements across the entire urban landscape. If one was threatened or injured, the entire grid vibrated with a sharp, high-frequency warning. Within seconds, dozens of them would converge on the source of the disturbance, moving with a synchronized precision that suggested a hive mind or a highly sophisticated pheromonal command structure. They were building a civilization upon the ruins of ours, using our own iron to forge the foundations. As the sun sets on a world that no longer belongs to the people who built it, the true scale of the transformation becomes clear. Julian looked out at the city and realized he was witnessing the birth of a new era, one where the urban landscape was a living, breathing organism. The steel and concrete of his ancestors were merely the skeleton for this new, crimson flesh. These bloodweavers did not hate humanity, nor did they seek to exterminate it out of spite. To them, we were a vital, renewable resource, a crop to be managed and harvested with cold, biological efficiency. They were the new stewards of the planet, and they had built their throne out of the very lifeblood of the old world. Julian reached out and touched Sarah's hand. It was cold, and he realized with a jolt of terror that she was no longer looking at the TV. She was looking at the vent above the door. The nights were the most difficult to endure. In the total dark, the scarlet mesh glowed with a soft, bioluminescent hum, turning the city into a glowing nervous system mapped out across the earth. From a great distance, it might even look beautiful, a shimmering tapestry of rubies and light. But close up, the beauty vanished. You could hear the truth in the air. You could hear the faint, synchronized beating of 10,000 hearts, all held in the grip of the wire. You could hear the skittering of claws on glass, a sound that never seemed to stop. And you could feel the vibration in your own chest, a constant, low-frequency reminder that you were being watched, measured, and waited for. The predator in the vent shifted its weight, and the sound of its chitinous legs against the metal was like the sharpening of a knife. Sarah's breath hitched, a tiny, stuttering sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the room. Julian squeezed her hand, a final, desperate gesture of a man who had run out of time. He could see the first strand descending from the vent, a gossamer line of deep garnet that caught the dim light. It didn't fall. It navigated the air, seeking the heat of their proximity. He realized then that the hum he had been feeling wasn't just coming from the city, it was coming from them. They had been tuned, their bodies slowly synchronized to the frequency of the web until they were no longer invisible. They were now part of the chorus. The predator above wasn't guessing. It was coming home to a signal it had been tracking for days. There is no escape from a world that has been rewoven. Even the air Julian breathed was filled with microscopic spores of the weaver's thread, settling in his lungs, slowly binding him from the inside out. It was a slow, methodical conquest. The architects were patient because they had already won the architectural war. They had turned homes into traps and bodies into fuel. As Julian sat in the dark, watching a new strand of garnet wire tighten around his door handle, he realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't the predator itself. It was the realization that his own heart was now beating only to serve the growth of the web. He could feel the first filament brush against his neck, as light as a spider web, as heavy as a death sentence. The final stage of the infestation is known as the solidification. This is the moment when the hunters stop hunting and begin to merge the individual cocoons into the permanent structural fabric of the city. The scarlet filaments turn into a black, obsidian-like substance that is harder than granite and more durable than any man-made alloy. The trapped consciousness is finally silenced as the biological material is fully integrated into the new world. The city becomes a silent monument of black glass and red light, a tomb for a civilization that forgot it was part of a food chain. Once the solidification is complete, the weavers move on, trailing their red lines behind them, looking for the next cluster of lights on the horizon, the next harvest of blood to be woven into the sky. The cycle repeats, an endless expansion of crimson geometry. Every city, every town, every gathering of warmth and pulse is a potential target. These creatures are the ultimate collectors, the drapers of the apocalypse. They do not leave ruins, they leave art. They leave a world perfectly preserved in a cage of its own essence, a masterpiece of iron and silk that will stand long after the last heartbeat has faded into the hum of the web. You can try to run, you can try to hide, but the architects have already measured the distance of your stride and the frequency of your fear. The web is already waiting. The red line is already drawn. Julian didn't look away as the shadow dropped from the ceiling. He simply watched the carmine thread bridge the gap between his skin and the dark. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the cadence of the lattice. He was no longer a husband, a citizen, or a man. He was merely a sequence of pulses, a temporary vessel of iron, waiting to be integrated into the foundation of a silent, crystalline world.